Ecosystem is a card drafting game for 2 to 6 players and only takes about 15 minutes to play. You'll need enough table space so that each player can make a grid of cards exactly 5 cards wide by 4 cards high. Give each player a player aid, then deal 10 cards to each player. That's it for setup. You're ready to play Ecosystem. All players take their turns simultaneously. Each turn, you and the other players will do the following 4 steps. Step 1. Choose a card from your hand of cards. Keep it secret by laying it face down on top of your player aid. Step 2. Pass the cards you didn't select to the player on your left, laying them face down next to that player's player aid. Step 3. Once everyone has selected a card, reveal your card. Step 4. Place your card into your grid of cards. If it's your first card of the game, then lay it down and begin your grid. There are rules for placing cards that we'll get into in just a minute. All players perform these 4 steps at the same time, so the hands of cards will travel around the table, getting smaller as each player selects a card from it. Placing cards into your grid is easy, but there are several important things to remember. Cards must be placed orthogonally adjacent to an existing card. That just means the card must be placed directly beside, above, or below a card that's already in the grid. Diagonal placement is not allowed. The first card in your grid is the exception and can simply be placed into the grid. Once a card has been placed, it cannot be moved, unless you play a rabbit later. We'll talk about rabbits in a moment. Your grid of cards must be exactly 5 cards wide by 4 cards high by the end of the game. Your grid can never exceed these dimensions. Once every player has 10 cards in their grid, the first round ends and the second round begins. The second round plays exactly like the first round. Deal 10 cards to each player again, and repeat steps 1 through 4 10 more times. Except players pass the unselected cards to their right. After all players have placed their 20th card, the game ends, and players move on to scoring, using the card type's individual scoring methods. Assign 1 player to be the scorekeeper. Proceed down the score sheet, recording each player's score for each individual card type. Mark a 0 for each non-scoring card type. Let's talk about the 11 different cards in Ecosystem. Most of them simply score based off their relative position to other cards. All of this information is on the rule sheet and the player aids. We'll start with bears, bees, and trout. A bear scores 2 points for each bee and trout orthogonally adjacent to it. Bees scored 3 points for each orthogonally adjacent meadow. Trout score 2 points for each orthogonally adjacent stream and dragonfly. Multiple cards can score off the same card in these instances. For example, 2 trout could each score off of a single dragonfly. An eagle scores 2 points for each rabbit and trout within 2 spaces of it orthogonally. A fox scores simply by hiding from larger predators. Each fox that is not orthogonally adjacent to a wolf or a bear scores 3 points. Deer score off their position in your grid relative to other deer, rather than to other card types. Each row and column that has at least 1 deer in it scores 2 points. Dragonflies are multiplied by the number of adjacent stream cards to score points. For example, 2 dragonflies along a stream that is 5 cards long will score 10 points. 2 times 5 is 10. Meadows are scored in groups. Groups of orthogonally adjacent meadows score 0, 3, 6, 10, or 15 points for having 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 meadows in that group. Additionally, meadows over 5 in a single group do not score additional points. Streams are scored based on their length as compared to other players at the end of the game. Each player compares only their longest stream to the other player's streams. The player with the longest stream, that is, the most orthogonally adjacent streams in a group, scores 8 points, while the player with the second longest scores 5 points. Tied players each get full points for their position. For example, 2 players who tie for the second longest stream each receive 5 points. Wolves also score relative to other players, but wolves do not have to be adjacent to one another. Players count up the number of wolves they have, compare them to the other player's counts, then score. The player with the most wolves receives 12 points, second most 8 points, and third most scores 4 points. Just like with streams, tied players each receive full points. Rabbits are special, and do not by themselves score points. Instead, playing a rabbit allows a player to adjust their grid. Immediately after you place a rabbit, you may then switch the position of any 2 cards in your grid. This switch may include the rabbit, or you may switch the position of 2 other cards. The last thing to do is count up each player's number of zeros to deduct points for the lack of diversity. An ecosystem needs many different plants and animals to thrive, and as such, players lose 2, 5, or 10 points for having 4, 5, or 6 or more zeros on their scorepad. Once positive scores have been adjusted by the lack of diversity penalty, record each player's final score. The highest score is the winner. In the case of a tie, the player with the fewest zeros on the score sheet is the winner. If the players are still tied, then the highest number of wolves determine the winner. If there is still a tie, then the players share the victory.